I'm speaking with an expert in his field, Professor Brad Roth, a professor of international law and political science at Wayne State University. He just returned from serving as a visiting scholar at the Center for Law and Society at the University of California at Berkeley, and he has agreed to fit us into his busy schedule, and I'd like to think it's because I'm his former student. Professor Roth, thank you so much for joining me on Ukraine Watch. I'm honored to have you on.
Well, I'm so proud to have a former student doing this, so it's a pleasure is mine.
I appreciate that. So I want to dive in to some heavy stuff here, including what we might be able to categorize as either pretense or justification for Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I'm going to reveal the man behind the curtain and say I think there's no actual justification for it, and I think most people will agree with me. But regardless, I have a bit of a qualm with the mainstream narrative having to do with NATO expansion being a provocative thing that that caused this conflict. And the reason is, I want to get your, and this leading up to my question, I want to get your opinion on whether or not you think that the authorities of the Russian Federation viewed NATO expansion as really a legitimate threat to their national security, or is this a pretense?
My sense about this, and I don't claim any special Kremlinology expertise, but my sense of it is that it's really neither of those things, that it is a blow to Russian national pride. It is a blow to the self-conception, which is important to the political legitimacy of the regime of the Russian Federation being a great power, and particularly in terms of its relationship to what is referred to as the near abroad. And this has to be seen in light of what happened in 1991, which is a very unusual way for countries to gain independence. Usually you have secessions from a metropolitan state. In the case of the former Yugoslavia, you had secessions of units that represented more than half of the pre-existing state. But in the Soviet Union, you really had the center seceding from the periphery in some sense. You had the dissolution of the Soviet Union being precipitated by decisions made in the Russian Federation because of the power relations between the Russian Federation government and the Union government. And so what you had was this consensual dissolution, quite different from the non-consensual dissolution of the former Yugoslavia. And you had, putting it to one side, the Baltic states, which are a whole separate complicated set of questions. You have the 12 republics of the USSR dissolving into their pre-existing units as republics within those borders. But I think that the sense on the part of the Russians was that although these are self-governing units at this point, they are not sovereign equals of the Russian Federation, and that this is not only a kind of sphere of influence properly of the Russian Federation, but that these are states as to which Russian intervention is a discretionary matter. And so these were what the Russians wanted as the rules of the game. This Commonwealth of Independent States construct was one manifestation of that. But I think the problem is, just as the United States interpreted the so-called Monroe Doctrine to basically license U.S. intervention in its quote-unquote backyard, or sometimes its front yard, in states that were seen as leaving the orbit of the United States and potentially aligning with great powers from outside. So too, the Russian Federation, I think, had a strong sense, not only within Putin's inner circle, but more broadly, that there was a prerogative to prevent any alignments of those republics with foreign powers, and to allow that to happen would be to reveal Russia as, to use the old Nixonian language, a pitiful, helpless giant. And so this has been warned about for a long time by a lot of strategic experts, going back to the 90s and beyond. And so it's not a big surprise that the Russians took great exception to the idea of NATO encroaching, and indeed took great exception to the idea of the European Union being expanded into Ukraine.
So I want to go back to something you said about the dissolution of the Soviet Union being the center, in some sense, seceding from the periphery. When you look at sort of the events that precipitated into the dissolution of the Soviet Union, I think you have to start back at the coup, right? Back in, I think, August 19th, with the famous famous ballet switch. I guess for me it's famous. It's the Soviet state television switched on, I think it was the Bolshoi or something like that, because the country was falling apart. There was a faction of hardliners that were not satisfied with perestroika, and they wanted to take over, and it failed. But shortly after that, in August 24th, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic declared independence by a vote of its parliament, which was followed by a referendum on December 1st of 91, where every province of what is now the Republic of Ukraine, including Crimea, voted with a majority to secede, to be independent. And so there's this famous Russian phrase from that time, "Какой союз без Украины?" What union without Ukraine?
Without Ukraine, yeah.
And then
I remember a little bit of Russian from high school.
yeah, and then suddenly we have this declaration that we're dissolving the union. But I don't know, much like many things that are like the Bolshoi on the television when there's a coup going on, like the struggle session Politburo meeting that Vladimir Putin had right before the full-scale invasion, it all is kind of a theater, or maybe to take off of what President Nixon said, it's sort of a painted rust. The facade is painted rust. Do you think they had a choice? In other words, the union was going to fall apart anyway.
Well, for one thing, obviously the political situation had reached a certain crisis where there had been a complete delegitimation of the union government. And the main source of political legitimacy at that moment in the central, sort of halls of power were the people in charge of the government of the Russian Federation. And, I don't know what calculations were undertaken at that point, but, clearly this was a moment of opportunity for those in the republics, regardless of their ideology or nationalistic orientation. This was an opportunity to escape the yoke of the union. But the fact is that this was allowed to happen, notwithstanding the fact that Russians had dominated the union. And of course, you can hold a referendum anywhere you like. It doesn't necessarily mean that this has any kind of significance from the standpoint of internal or external law. And so, there may be any number of places that would, seek to hold referenda or hold referenda that would be ignored, not only by the central authorities of the state, but by the international community as a whole. And we can talk further about international law relating to secession. But basically, you had this unraveling, this peaceful unraveling of the Soviet Union. And I think that there is a sense in which the Russians are unreconciled at least to all of the remote consequences of that, unreconciled to the idea that the other republics have become sovereign equals of the Russian Federation in an international system. That's a lot for them to swallow. And so I think, again, a lot of the discussion about the war has to do with the psychology of Putin, but I think it's not just that. I think that there is a much wider sense of consciousness that the Russian Federation's role in the world needs to be in some way respected and heeded, and that it is a finger in the eye of Russian pride and power for there to be these kinds of encroachments, first in Georgia and then in Ukraine. And so this is, I think, a backlash to that.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm getting at, and I don't know if you've noticed the thread that I'm trying to pull through the narrative here that I'm trying to build, and I acknowledge that, you know, Ukrainian and Russian history and the history of this war is not only complicated, but it's disputed. I mean, you can't even use the word war in the context of Ukraine and Russia without facing possible criminal charges. Yeah. But I guess what I'm getting at is this. Could you view this war as inevitable as long as the Russian Federation is ruled by the type of autocrat? And I don't mean to speculate to get into the mind of Vladimir Putin, because obviously we can't do that. But the viewpoint that's being expressed now, the mainstream viewpoint in Russian media, is that Ukraine, not only as a state, but as a concept, as a people, as a culture, has no legitimacy or doesn't exist, is the narrative thread now. And so it seems like NATO expansion, regardless of NATO expansion, even though it seems, you're probably right, it would be a thumb in the eye of that viewpoint in Russia as being the whatever they view themselves as. But also that there's a sort of a special, I hate to use this terminology, but a special relationship between Ukraine and Russia. Maybe you want to call it love-hate, wherein one party views itself differently than the other party does. You get what I'm getting at?
Yeah, no, I do. And I think that it's very difficult to tell about these things. And this is why I want to be cautious about speaking beyond the scope of my expertise, because depending upon, what is the chicken and what is the egg, you have different ways of viewing what really is going on here. So on the one hand, you have a certain strain of nationalism within Russia, which has a particular conception of Ukraine as the cradle of Russian civilization, I guess, and the idea that Ukrainian national consciousness itself is artificial and a result of the machinations of external powers looking to interfere in the neighborhood and so forth. And therefore, and the natural analog to that, when did we see this before? Well, it was Nazism, and so you get this sort of thing. But that ideology it's not clear to me that was something that was driving policy of Putin and his inner circle, or whether that was something that was adopted post hoc after certain decisions had been taken in order to provide some sort of rationalization for what was otherwise going on. You have these kinds of nationalist extremists who are often convenient to a regime, but it's mostly just blather. And then when kind of Plan A failed, there needed to be a kind of explanation for why that would happen, because I think that Putin expected that this would be a pretty quick operation and that Kiev would fall with relatively little trouble, and that he could displace the government. And after all, you think about what happened in Hungary in 1956 and in Czechoslovakia in 1968. These were pretty straightforward operations. the idea that that there would be not only this level of resistance, but this level of inefficacy and perhaps incompetence on the part of the Russian military was something that caught people quite by surprise. And it seems like, you know, the rhetoric of the Russian Federation has become more extreme the more difficulty it is encountered in the course of all of this. But I don't know to what extent any of the decision making is ultimately driven by this ideological conception, or how much of their own state legitimacy was in any sense predicated on that ideological vision, or rather that they just sort of adopted it post hoc at a certain moment when it was needed to rationalize what they had decided to do for other reasons. So on that depends the question of you know, what the role of NATO is in all of this, because on the one hand, you know, there's this great irony that you know, the reason why the Ukrainians want to be part of NATO is to be protected from exactly what happened, and the claim is that becoming part of NATO is what precipitates exactly what happened. But it's hard to unpack that without a deep knowledge of the internal decision-making dynamics in Moscow. And I not only do I not have that, but I'm very skeptical of the people who claim to have it.
That's a good point. I mean, one of the, regarding the internal workings in Moscow, it's probably unclear to anyone outside of Vladimir Putin's inner circle exactly what's going on there. However, when I look at some circumstantial evidence, there are things that form opinions that I form based partially on, I guess, my understanding of the Ukrainian and Russian language, for things that I think sometimes get missed in the West. But also, I would also concede that, you know, when the Bush administration seems to open the door, at least rhetorically, to Ukraine and Georgia about joining NATO, and then that door is then slammed in the face of those countries, and, you know, because of the obvious political implications of what that might bring, I still think that NATO expanding or not, and this is obviously my view, that NATO expanding or not, someone like Vladimir Putin would have engaged in whatever means that he saw fit to reincorporate Ukraine into the Russian fold. And the things that I look at are things that I guess are missed in the West. And I don't want to go too far out of your expertise, but they're even sort of just grammatical turns, like the Russian tendency to refer to Ukraine with the, for example, they say na Ukraini rather than v Ukraini, which is, you know, means nothing to an English speaker other than it's sort of like the word na implies that it's a territory. Like in Russian, you would say about America, I'm going to Florida, you'd say na Florida. Or in Ukrainian, you'd say na Florida, because you're saying it's a part of it's a territory that's part of something else, sort of implying that this viewpoint that I've grown up with as a Ukrainian American, that you're a little Russian or you're a confused Russian. And so I think that kind of gets lost in the West. And like I said, I don't want to go too far down that wormhole with you, because I know you're not an expert in that. However, when I look at circumstantially at this, Putin's been doing this for years. Did it with Georgia. He's done it with Syria. He did it within his own territory with Chechnya. And so I don't quite see, and I know I'm harping on this now, but I don't quite see the justification of NATO expansion as being viewed, even if you're not going into the mind of Vladimir Putin, as a legitimate threat to Russian national security.
Well, again, you know, I don't think it's a threat to national security in the sense that we would ordinarily conceptualize national security. But then the United States has often thought of its own national security in ways that no one from outside could take seriously either. You know, I mean, this nonsense. I lived through all the nonsense in the 1980s about the Nicaragua being in our front yard or our backyard or whatever the heck. And the notion, and remember, even more ridiculously, people might remember the invasion of Grenada in October of 1983, and that was really occasioned by the fact that the Cubans and Soviets were engaged in assisting the Grenadians to build an international airport, which was needed for touristic purposes, which was a crucial part of the Grenadian economy. But also, if it could handle jets, it could handle MiGs. So that became the trope for all of this, and it was clear that the Reagan administration took the position that Grenada, along with the change of government in Nicaragua and events going on in El Salvador, represented this threat to U.S. national security. From the outside, this looks ridiculous, and yet it fits into people's national security doctrine in a certain way that 15 steps removed from the actual thing, represents this kind of existential threat from people's perspectives. So the fact that people may have perceived it as a national security threat and whether it was actually one are not that closely related.
Great. All right, let's delve into international law a little bit. I'm going to challenge you on the idea of genocide, because I know you're going to push back on this. So I was talking a little bit before about sort of some of the things that get lost in the Western perspective. Some of those things are, for example, predating this full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Putin wrote an op-ed and posted it on the Kremlin's website about the historical connection between Ukraine and Russia. It was sort of his take on the history and why they're one people. You have in the center of Moscow a monument to another Volodymyr, who is essentially the Prince of Kiev 1,000 years ago, who adopted Christianity, and his coat of arms is the coat of arms of Ukraine, and yet there's a statue of him in Moscow. And then you have the RIA Novosti article that came out not too long ago about the problem of Ukraine, what to do about Ukrainians, that argued that anybody who identifies as Ukrainian or the concept of Ukraine is a fascist, and Ukrainians are Nazis just in and of themselves when it comes to Russia, and that it has to be eliminated. So when I couple that with the utter brutality that we've seen in places like Mariupol or in Bucha, and then Vladimir Putin rewarding and awarding those combatants, I guess, or even rhetorically, and the stuff coming out of Russian media, how is this not genocide? How is it not one group trying to eliminate, at least in part, another group?
Well, yeah, the difficulty with the genocide definition is that, when you're talking about eliminating a group in whole or in part, that begs the question, really. Almost anything could count as that, by some sort of semantic extrapolation. But the real question is, are we looking really at an effort to eliminate a people, and what does that actually mean? One of the problems of these kinds of statements of, sort of not like sort of legal statements, but political statements with respect to certain kinds of atrocity is that there is necessarily a kind of rhetorical inflation that goes along with these things, because whatever the worst category of thing there is, that should be the category that should apply to what's being done to the people that I'm most concerned with. And so, so there's always this pressure to characterize things as genocide or as crimes against humanity, and to sort of push against the limits of what's been legally established in court cases, such limited court cases as there have been, with respect to these sorts of categories. I think it's remarkable that genocide has not been used promiscuously in international courts. If you look at, for example, how the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia has dealt with the issue of genocide, it has been quite conservative, and really has refused to go down that path with respect to most of the incidents that took place over the course of the 3.5-year war in Bosnia, where there were certainly lots of mass killings and complete with serious kinds of expressions of ethnic animosity. The real example of genocidal conduct that was cited was the Srebrenica massacre, where what happened was essentially that all of the men and boys in this town that was sacked were basically identified and eliminated. And so the question of what counts as genocide remains a sort of open textured one in the international system. This is an unusual situation because usually perpetrators of genocide are trying to other the people that they are committing this act against, and here it's almost this weird inverse of that what they're trying to do is to reclaim the latent Russian identity of Ukrainians from this sort of false consciousness that's been instilled by some Western ideology associated with Nazism, and so they have to find some way to expunge that. And it's a little bit reminiscent to me of what happened in Taiwan when the Nationalist Party's forces took power in 1945. People largely don't know this history, but Taiwan had been ceded by the Qing Empire, Qing Dynasty in 1895 to the Japanese Empire, and so for 2 generations, Taiwanese grew up under Japanese rule and Japanese culture and ways of life were sort of imposed upon the island. And then when Chiang Kai-shek's forces came and reclaimed the territory after the end of the war, their attitude was that the local population had been contaminated. And so this gave rise to very serious clashes between Kuomintang forces and the local population, leading to what was called the 228 incident, where there was an uprising by Taiwanese against the Kuomintang, and the resulting repression led to something on the order of 30,000 people were massacred by the Chinese army in Taiwan, and Taiwan remained under martial law until 1987. So it was really this imposition of China and people from the mainland of China onto a territory that was a kind of renegade territory in some sense, and an effort to sort of assert the inherent Chinese nature of a population that had kind of gotten away from them. So here there seems, it's obviously even worse what the Russians are doing in Ukraine here, but to use the term genocide creates all sorts of difficulties. I think that there's a more pragmatic question with respect to genocide, which is that once you use language like that, it becomes very difficult to figure out a way out of conflict short of the capitulation of the other side. And so how do people imagine this whole thing ending? If people were talking about war crimes trials and all of this sort of thing, that makes sense after you've won the war and you have the defeated forces at your mercy. It's very hard to imagine a scenario that looks like that here. And so when you take these sort of maximalist stances toward the leadership of the other side of a conflict that in the end is going to have to be resolved through some kind of negotiation, you're really very much complicating the process if you have already told your own constituency that these people are kinds of maximal criminals that we can't share a world with. And so I think people in my own profession, I would say this is my little way of taking a dig at my colleagues. I think that they're making a big mistake by indulging in this kind of rhetoric because I think it's a tendency to burn one's bridges behind oneself in this way that I think is not helpful. There's got to be an off-ramp to this. And it's you're cluttering the off ramp if you're adding in all of these kinds of stipulations about the settling of accounts that's supposed to occur, which can really only occur after you've won a war that there's basically no way of unambiguously winning.
Well, I think from the Ukrainian perspective, total victory is probably the only even politically feasible outcome when you're talking about sort of anybody who's going to be viewed as a legitimate leader of Ukraine. And I want to take this as a segue and talk about this concept of the off-ramp, but I want to do that in our second part here. So I want to circle back to a couple of things that you said about using the rhetoric surrounding genocide. Now, there was, during the Soviet period in the early 30s, there was an artificial famine created by Stalin, collectivization famine in Ukraine called the Holodomor, which Ukrainians, and I think the United States government acknowledges as a genocide. And in that perspective, it was basically killing of Soviet dissidents, mostly Ukrainian, and it was viewed as Stalin's way of basically getting what he wanted, getting control of the territory. Now, there's a big distinction, obviously, in my mind, between what we all think of when we say genocide, which is the Holocaust, and what's going on now in Ukraine, in that for the Nazi German regime, there was no redemption for a Jewish person. It was clearly, there's unambiguously an attempt to eradicate a peoples. Here, you kind of alluded to this. We have the Russian viewpoint is, okay, you're a confused Russian, Ukrainian. And I just want to put that a little bit in context, and that, and I hope this doesn't sound pedantic, but it's the term Russia for Russia didn't come into popular practice until Peter the Great, after the term Ukraine had already been in use, after the Ukrainian language already existed. Muscovy adopted Rus or Russia as sort of an homage to the medieval principality that was ruled by Kiev, hundreds of years before, and then started to say, well, we're the legitimate continuation of that, despite whatever historical facts to the contrary there exist. But the idea is this: if you speak Ukrainian, if you identify as Ukrainian, you have to be either eliminated or re-educated. But the only thing that can save you is full capitulation. In other words, become Russian, and maybe we'll let you alone. So in that regard, I can see your point that genocide, it's hard to fit that into genocide. On the other hand, what we're talking about is existential, because the Russian regime clearly now wants to eradicate everything in Ukraine. And so when we talk about off-ramp, here's getting my question. I don't know that there could be an off-ramp. You know, how do you bring Vladimir Putin back into the fold after what's happened? I know that's a tough question.
It's very difficult. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why this is an extraordinary challenge, and why these actions by the Russian government are actually a much more severe departure from other violations of the international law of peace and security that we have seen in the post World War II era. Notwithstanding all of the other terrible things that have happened, there's a certain framework at stake here, and the framework has been violated in a much more fundamental way on this occasion than it has been in other occasions, and we could discuss those, although it comes as no surprise to you. But the fact remains that this is not going to end with NATO forces sacking the Kremlin. Even in the best case scenario, this government in the Russian Federation is going to remain, and that being the case, there simply is like being too big to fail. There really isn't an alternative to finding some way for Russia to be brought back into the community of states. And so that's even putting aside the question of what kinds of impingements upon the territorial integrity and political independence of Ukraine might have to be abided. Because the fact is that the Russian Federation is in possession of the capacity to wreak a level of destruction, not only on Ukrainians, but on anyone else that they see fit, that is almost beyond comprehension. And we assume that people who have those kinds of destructive devices at their disposal would not use them, because there are all sorts of rational reasons to not use them, certainly from the standpoint, if you think of it in realist terms as the way that states relate to one another. But if you think in terms of a regime that may see itself as having nothing to lose, then Putin cannot win a strategic victory in this war from here on out, regardless. The question is whether he will suffer a kind of defeat that would be intolerable to him, not only psychologically, but politically, in terms of the ability of the regime itself to survive. And from the standpoint of regime survival, using nuclear weapons might not be, the summum malum. When people find themselves in a situation where the stakes have changed, and the stakes for them as a regime or as an institution are intolerable, they are potentially willing to go down fighting, and the consequences are beyond anything that we've been able to get our minds around to this point. So I think we have to take that into account and to take it seriously. And that being the case, it's very, very difficult to know what to do. On the one hand, one wants to bolster the defenses of Ukraine to whatever extent is feasible. And on the other hand, to see to it that we don't find ourselves in a kind of escalation that will lead to basically destroying the village in order to save it, and that can happen in more than one way. Not just U.S. forces destroying a village in order to save it, but U.S. forces and allied forces, bringing about the conditions in which the other side might see fit to wreak extraordinary destruction. Another thing to think about in terms of historical analogies is the Korean War. That people remember the Korean War as lasting for 3 years, and what they often don't remember is that the lion's share of the destruction and the lion's share of the time spent in the Korean War came after the North Korean assault on South Korea had been pushed back. And it was the maximalist goals of the United States and its allies at that time that led to the perpetuation of the war, led to an eventuality that no one apparently had anticipated, which was the massive intervention of the People's Republic of China in the conflict at the time. And so by being on the threshold of a total victory, the United States set itself up for an incredibly bloody stalemate. And so we got to think of it in those terms as well.
So let's take ourselves back from the brink of the thought experiment that could lead to nuclear war to something a little bit more optimistic. And I expect pushback on this too, but I'm hoping I don't get it. So the International Criminal Court, Slobodan Milosevic is the famous case of a leader.
Oh, the ICTY, not the ICC.
Oh, excuse me. But he's a famous case of a leader who gets indicted and then he's given up and then he's charged and convicted. So,
well, it didn't actually get to conviction because he died beforehand, but yeah.
Right. Excuse me. I always have to remember I'm talking with an expert here.
I used to watch the trial. In fact, he died right before a session that I was going to go see. So,
well, you've got me on that. So let's talk about Putin in that context. And I want to talk about a specific case, because we're both lawyers. So let's imagine a scenario where there's a charge for an international crime and that there's an indictment. So just to kind of briefly go over it, there is jurisdiction in Ukraine because Ukraine has acquiesced to it, essentially, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And let's take an example.
And territorial jurisdiction extends to territorial effects. And so if the intended and actual effects of the decision taken outside the country occur in the territory of the state that has acceded to jurisdiction, then the act as a whole falls within the jurisdiction.
Okay. And so let's take an example like the horrible atrocities we saw in Mariupol or in Bucha. And then imagine a scenario where, not too hard to imagine, where Vladimir Putin gives an award to the fighters who did that.
Yeah.
Right? And then you gather the evidence. How do you impute liability onto Vladimir Putin for the acts of his soldiers?
Right. So this is the principle of command responsibility in international law. And so there have been a number of devices that have been developed over the years to see to it that people who are at some remove from the atrocities be held responsible for them. And for commanders in a chain of command is the most straightforward scenario. And clearly, if you have masterminded the atrocities, then you're going to be culpable. But if you have sort of failed to take precautions against those kinds of atrocities and or have refused to take any measures against those who have perpetrated the atrocities, then the atrocities can be imputed to you. And so the most famous case about this had to do with the military governor of the Philippines during World War II, General Yamashita, in a rather disreputable trial, I have to say, that was held by the United States Armed Forces in Manila. But there was some real question as to whether the command responsibility doctrine was being abused there, because Yamashita was being held responsible for acts that he had no way of finding out about because his own communications were being disrupted by the United States at the time. Still in all, the doctrine has never been questioned that that if you are in effective command and you have failed to take appropriate measures to prevent atrocities and have failed to punish those who have committed those atrocities, assuming you've had the opportunity to do so, then you would be held liable. And so I think it's a slam dunk in this case under that doctrine for Vladimir Putin. When you start pinning medals on people who've committed atrocities, that pretty well links you to their having committed. Yeah.
All right, so imagine we get an indictment, which who knows, one might be coming. Obviously, you can't send somebody into Moscow, into the Kremlin, and drag him out, kicking and screaming. But you can imagine a scenario. I mean, you look at the fall of the Soviet Union was largely economic. The creation of the Soviet Union after the fall of the Russian Empire was largely economic. Russia's economy is now isolated somewhat, not entirely, but enough that it's causing an effect. And who knows down the line? I mean, this thing could drag out for a while, but you can imagine a scenario where finally either he dies or somebody gets around him gets fed up enough that they can't, buy Gucci or access Western markets or send their children to Oxford or whatever, and they give him up. So I guess feasibly you could have an end to this war because Vladimir Putin is facing criminal charges.
Well, I think the causality would be reversed. So the problem with international criminal justice is it's a day late and a dollar short, always. So this is what happens to people after they have lost, after they have been put out of power. And then, the successor regime has calculations to make about whether they're better off shipping the person off to The Hague to be prosecuted, or whether for reasons of their own internal politics, it would be better to sort of stand by their person, notwithstanding this. And one of the problems is that the people who would take power in a coup would presumably be people who are just as susceptible to international criminal prosecution as Putin himself. Nobody does these things alone. It's not, there was an episode of the old Star Trek, I'm dating myself all of this, where, the commander has this device in his quarters where he could just sort of focus a camera on the person, push a button, and cause that person to be obliterated. That's not how anything works in the real world. You have to actually have complex structures where people can give orders and other people can obey orders that lead to these kinds of acts being perpetrated. And so there is a lot of co-perpetration and a lot of complicity with all of this. And so the people who would succeed Putin would, in almost any plausible scenario, be people who would have their own criminal liabilities. So which way that cuts is unclear.
Yeah, but for political expediency, you could imagine a scenario where they cut a deal. They say, we'll give you this guy, leave us alone.
They might. No, that's certainly possible, but it's not going to be the thing that impels a solution to the war. Rather, it's going to be defeat in the war that's going to lead to the person being subjected to this. So in the case of Milosevic, Milosevic didn't end up in the situation he was in because he fought the war. He got in that situation because he lost the war, and so he was then ousted by a political community that to this day has never really renounced the war that they perpetrated. Alexander Vučić is the current leader of Serbia, and I could show you footage of him back in the day being one of the worst. So this sort of thing happens, but it happens for sort of ancillary reasons, and it's putting the cart before the horse on the one hand, to be talking about international criminal justice, but even more significantly, by talking about international criminal justice, it seems to me that one is complicating the process, particularly by undermining any potential political support in the West for being able to make the kinds of responsible concessions that need to be made in order to prevent some kind of further disaster. And so, you know, I don't like the idea of holding out for a war to end all wars, which tends to follow from a kind of idealist conception of international affairs, where we're going to predicate peace on justice. Peace is more frequently peace among criminals, and I think we would do well to keep that in mind.
Well, I guess it's sort of, for all parties involved, there's, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, because on the one hand, if the West acquiesces and basically hands over, I mean, just does a 360 or 180 rather, and hands over Ukraine, you could then argue, well, there's an old Ukrainian adage that your appetite arrives while you're eating. So, you know, you give up Ukraine, Poland's next door, you've got the Baltic states. There's more expansion that I'm sure Vladimir Putin would love to be involved in. And then on the other hand, if you tax all of his resources to the point where he's got nothing left except for nukes, then, you know, the consequences of that could be world ending, not just country ending. So I guess I'm not going to ask you to, you know, give us any kind of prediction or take us down any kind of, you know, branches of different scenarios, other than to say, you know, what else is there for the West to do at this point than what they've already been doing?
Well, I think in some ways, given the circumstances, the policies have been remarkably successful. So, you know, there's no reason not to continue to try to bolster the military capacity of Ukraine to resist the invasion. But on the other hand, there's a certain kind of attitude that one needs to bring to this ultimately, that is a realistic one, and that avoids inflammatory kinds of acts and statements, not so much because it would get the other side angry, but which is the way people ordinarily think about it, but because it will undermine one's own capacity politically to be able to sell the kinds of unpleasant concessions that will need to be made, including, of course, the concession that there won't be a settling of accounts, because there's just no scenario that I can imagine whereby an end to this conflict is going to be brought about in conjunction with a formula for international criminal justice at the highest level. There's just no way that you're going to let people are not going to negotiate to cut their own throats, particularly when they have nuclear weapons in reserve.
Sure. On the other hand, we're what, 3-4 months in, and this is supposed to last 3 days. There's a lot of things that, you know, who knows. But Professor Roth, I really appreciate your time. I thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and expanding on some of these concepts and letting me challenge you a little bit even. I hope that we'll get to talk again, and hopefully it'll be under more pleasant circumstances, and then we'll have something better to talk about.
Yes, let's hope for that. My best to you, and again, I can only express great pride in you as a graduate of our law school and as a former student of mine, going on to do great things. So, congratulations.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Take good care.